A number of years ago, Apple came out with a commercial to sell its watch. It advertised that, among other things, it could track your sleep, check your heart rate, send you various notifications, and even make phone calls for you. At the end of the commercial, the narrator said, "Oh, yeah, and it can also tell time." Now, I know that I'm in the target demographic for this commercial because most of my friends have smartwatches. In some ways, they're really cool. It's nice to know how many steps you've walked in a day, or being able to see a text message without having to fish through your purse or your pocket. And my friends really like talking into their phones like they're walkie talkies. I used to have an Apple Watch and a Fitbit too, but I gave them up. Why? Honestly, I thought the thing was kind of bullying me. It told me when it thought I was not walking enough, when I thought I was having a perfectly productive day working on my rabbinic thesis, it made me feel bad that I wasn't exercising or standing up every hour. I also had a hard time feeling present in my physical conversations when my watch would buzz and buzz and buzz. This might come as a surprise to you, but I am a millennial. The Pew Foundation defines the millennial generation as those being born between 1981 and 1996. I'll let you do the math on that. As a millennial, I was old enough to remember 9/11 and understand the historical significance of this American tragedy. I was also born into a technological world. I remember the squeak of AOL, but not a world without internet. I was heavily influenced by Steve Jobs and his presentations of the iPod, the iPad, and the iPhone, where he would tell us that Apple had fixed problems we didn't know we had. Thomas Friedman taught us that our world is shrinking minute by minute. These devices help to shrink our world because suddenly a watch is first a means of communication and a time telling device is like the 14th thing that it does. Many refer to people of my generation as younger as digital natives because we are not only able to, but eager to adapt as technology changes. Forbes magazine says that my generation has placed such a priority on the internet and the cell phone that they cannot imagine a world without these devices. And they're right. While this is true for me, I know that it is probably true for you too. And that's okay. In fact, I think that's probably why these devices were invented. They make our lives easier. It puts the internet at our fingertips, where we can check the score of a ball game, where we can stay informed on current events, and keep in touch with everybody in our lives at all hours of the day, regardless of where they are in the world. Technology, by its very definition, is the application of science for practical purposes. Thanks to technology, when I lived in Israel in 2016, I was able to talk to my parents in California exactly the same that I could when I called up my classmate down the street. From the time when the cell phone was used only for emergencies because it cost $1 a minute, until now, the pendulum has swung. Just from my phone, I can send a text-based message on at least 4 different applications. And if I want to see people, there are other apps for that as well. Why is this important? Communication has taken a different and more significant role in our lives. And when we communicate well, we feel more connected to others. In fact, Dr. Ron Wolfson describes personal communication as sharing the stories of your life as the essential bridge and the connecting roadway of relationships. Wolfson describes the development of relationships in terms of how much we share about ourselves to others. At first, we engage in small talk, where we talk about impersonal things like the weather and traffic. Over time, as trust builds, We might reveal where we are from, what we do, and the very basics of who we are. Eventually, if the relationship deepens, we grow more comfortable sharing what's in here, in our hearts and our souls. With more ways to communicate than ever before, we should be able to enjoy deeper conversations with more people in our lives. It should be easier to communicate, easier to build relationships, but we all know that this is not the case. Somehow, we find ourselves within a paradox. Today, there are more ways to communicate, and yet, we as a society suffer from more miscommunications than ever before. So often, miscommunication begins with the technology that we choose. We are too busy thinking about what we want to say and how we want to say it that we do not consider what will be the experience of the person we are trying to reach. Over time, these sorts of miscommunications impact our ability to form and maintain meaningful relationships. When this happens, we risk focusing on our own individual journeys. But our world was not meant to be lived independently. And if we continue to miscommunicate, our families, our society, and our world will fall apart because the foundation of our world was built on relationships. Generations ago, when we entered the nuclear age, a hotline was established between the United States and Russia, so a miscommunication did not accidentally result in nuclear holocaust. Here, miscommunication could have literally destroyed the whole planet. Miscommunication is not a little thing. How many families have been destroyed by a miscommunication that could not be resolved? How many arguments begin with a message that was lost in a text or in an email? In 5783, we need to learn why we are miscommunicating and figure out how we can improve in the year to come. In 2016, 4 women who teach at top universities around the world, 2 at Oxford, 1 at Stanford, and 1 at Lancaster University, began this work when they realized that their incoming students spoke in a dramatically different way than previous classes. They decided to do a deep dive into Gen Z, interviewing hundreds of students born between 1997 and 2012 to find out who these kids really were. What was especially interesting to me was the emphasis that they placed on learning the language that the students were using. For Gen Z, their language begins in text form, and they text differently than we do. For example, if you agree with someone, you might text okay, like with an O and a K. Maybe you capitalize the O and maybe the K, maybe you don't. You might even add an exclamation point. But for Gen Z, these are all different OKs, and they all mean something a little bit different. There's the 2-letter OK, there's the formal 4-letter OK, there's KK and just K, but never KKK. If the response was spelled with a K and a period, Gen Z perceives curtness. Why? Well, first, the letter is lowercase, which indicates that the sender took time to undo the automatic capitalization. And second, when there's punctuation, Gen Z generally reads this as aggressive. A quick KK is more casual, understood to have a softer intonation than the letter K. Gen Zers interpret all of this from our texts, even though we probably didn't give as much thought to a letter or two as they did. Different generations communicating differently is nothing new. How many of you ever told your parents, "You guys just don't get it, it's slang"? And how many of you as parents said, "You guys just don't get it, it was the slang that we used"? Somebody from the baby boomer generation might use the word groovy to describe the same thing that Gen Z would use to describe as fire. The reality is that different generations of people use different words to describe the same experiences. They're saying the same thing, but they might need a translator to understand each other. It reminds me of two people who go on a really excellent first date, after which one person waits by the phone. A few days later, when the phone rings, they wonder, why did this take so long? But perhaps the person calling thought that it was more respectful to wait 3 days before asking for a second date. The two parties felt the same, but had different ways of expressing themselves. For some, this has the potential of being a relationship-altering miscommunication. We each miss the mark when we presume that our communication style and needs are the same as the person with whom we are communicating. We can learn a lot about how we communicate with each other by looking at how God communicates with us. In the Torah, most of the time, God communicates with the Israelites through Moses as an intermediary. But at Mount Sinai, God wanted to communicate with all of us directly. This was a new form of communication between the Israelites and God. As the 10 Commandments were given, God spoke to the Israelites using all of their senses. They witnessed thunder and lightning. They smelled the smoke of the smoldering mountain, and they heard the sound of God's voice. In the midst of this all, they heard the sound of the shofar growing louder and louder. The Israelites were closer to God than ever before. It was like they spoke each other's language. And after this intense moment of revelation, the Israelites begged Moses to make it stop because it was too hard and too intense for them. But then, the Israelites didn't hear anything from God for 40 days. It was like going on an excellent first date to radio silence. You can imagine the Israelites asking each other, "What's going on? Is God ghosting us?" See, following the moment of revelation, God continues giving Moses more than 50 commandments for the Israelites to follow. God reverted to only communicating with Moses, but the Israelites had no way of knowing this. The Israelites did not know how to understand God's silence. They could not see Moses, and they were left waiting by the phone. They assumed that God and Moses had abandoned them. And as a result of this miscommunication, the Israelites begged Aaron to make them a god that they could see and touch. After the creation of the golden calf, God threatens to destroy the Israelites. God could not understand why the Israelites could commit such a horrible sin. But because Moses knew how to communicate with God, and because he knew how to communicate with his people, Moses was able to heal this fracture and restore the covenant. We are not always good at noticing when our message is being misunderstood. In our day and age, we are often more interested in talking than in listening. When someone else is speaking, rather than listening carefully to what they're saying, we are usually thinking about what we want to offer as a response. We might choose to send a text instead of picking up the phone because it's faster, or if we're being honest, because we don't actually want to communicate that much with the other person. There are more miscommunications when we are selfish, when we are only thinking about ourselves and not about the person with whom we are trying to connect with. Communication only works when we develop sensitivity and understanding for the recipient of our message. God and Moses remembered that the Israelites had come from a society where they could see and touch their gods. God realized that the whole debacle of the golden calf was not a rejection of the covenant, but rather a cry for help. So the Holy One found another way to communicate by providing a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. This reminded the Israelites that God was always with them. And for later generations, God asked us to build a tabernacle, a physical place where we could come to communicate with the divine. In a world that is so divided, it is vital that we learn how to communicate better with each other. We need to learn how to heal the fractures that separate us. We need to learn how to listen more carefully to what others are really trying to say, so that when we share with others, we can truly be heard and understood. This is true for our families when miscommunication can tear us apart. This is true for our country when miscommunication can have catastrophic consequences. And this is true for our world where we speak in so many different languages that we often lose the ability to understand each other's hearts. There is a midrash that after this whole situation with the golden calf, Moses went back up to Mount Sinai to heal the people's rupture with God. Before Moses ascended, the Israelites blew the shofar as a way of demonstrating their communal repentance. Through the shofar, the Israelites communicated with God using the same technology that God had used to call them to revelation. The Israelites sounded the shofar to announce their recommitment to the covenant at Sinai and to declare their repentance using God's unique language. As we sound the shofar to announce the beginning of a new year, let it call us to listen with more sensitivity as we all strive to come together using communication to strengthen our relationships to each other, our community, and the world at large. Please turn to page 283 as we prepare to hear the call of the shofar that transcends language and speaks to us in a voice that we can all understand.